Our next speaker is Mark T. Johnson. And Mark is a professor with the University of Notre Dame and a fellow at Notre Dame's Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. Author of the recent book, The Middle Kingdom Under the Big Sky, A History of the Chinese Experience in Montana. Johnson's research focuses on telling the history of Chinese communities in the American West in their own words and through a global lens. His next project is an illustrated history of the Chinese experience in Montana. And this isn't in Mark's bio, but I'm professionally obligated to point out he's published several excellent articles in Montana, the magazine of Western history. Subscribe if you haven't already. Raised in Great Falls, Mark now lives in Helena. So without any other hubbub, here's Mark.
You picking me up there? That audio good? Good. So, as Cody mentioned, thank you for the introduction, and nice job, Kristen. I work for the University of Notre Dame, but this tells you how much I love this conference. What's today? Saturday during college football season. I think the Irish kick off against the Arkansas Razorbacks in about 3 minutes, but I'd much rather be here with you all. So I love what I do. I love this conference. I love people who bring their knowledge here. You've got my email address up there. A lot of you have stories of Chinese history of your parts of Montana. Share them with me. Ask me questions. Enlighten me. I want to continue to learn. And this project was actually something new that I was asked to do by Brenna Maloney with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to look at Bannack specifically and the Chinese presence or absence in Bannack. So we'll get into it, and I'm sure you know this history here. Montana had a large Chinese community at one point in time. First territorial census in 1870 had almost 2,000 Chinese Montanans enumerated, and that grew to 1890 to be 2,532 at its peak. And then you can see a pretty dramatic decline there. So they were really all across the state. This map here, I know it's kind of fine to see, but it shows where they were and in what numbers. So that map there, what I wanted to try to do is show where the Chinese were in Montana, how large their population was, and at what time it reached its height. You can see really they're all across the state. Sometimes when I make these presentations, people say, you know, if I'm outside of Montana, they say, well, why aren't there any here? It's like, well, you know. But I stopped the counting on this map at 10 or below, because if I did that, it would have just been too busy. We'd had 2 in Nyhart, 1 in Choteau, 1 in Depouillier, 4 in Forsyth, 8 in Glendive, and it just would have got too busy. But what about beyond this, to try and get past the numbers and the locations and them at their height? How can we try to understand this gentleman, who's depicted from Helena's Chinese community in about 1867-68? How can we know his hopes, his dreams, who he collaborated with, what obstacles he came up against? I want to try and break into that to know them beyond just the numbers. And sometimes we are able to do that with sources they left behind. I'm sure you can all read that pretty well. And so obviously, even when they do leave sources behind that could give us their own testimony and their own voice, it can be distanced from our modern understanding because of the language barrier. A couple of years ago, 15 years ago, in fact, I found hundreds of letters, all in Chinese at the Montana Historical Society, worked hard to try and get them translated. I don't have the language abilities to do that, but I was living and working in Shanghai, China at the time, and so my students really worked hard, and their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers worked hard to try and tell Montana's Chinese history in their own words whenever possible. However, that's not always possible, because what they left behind is pretty fragmentary. So those letters were from Butte's Chinese community, and Butte had a very large Chinese community. Depending on who you talk to is depending on how large it was. Because also, I'll linger here for just a second, estimating those numbers that I have on the map, I tend to be conservative in my estimation. I want to only put a number on that map if I can corroborate it with a number of different sources. And sometimes I run up against opposition, and people say, you had Missoula's Chinese population at just around 100? I've seen elsewhere that there was 405 Chinese folks in Missoula. Okay. You had German Gulch at like 40. I've heard experts say there was 2,500 Chinese in German Gulch. Okay. You have Butte at just at 1,000. I've heard people in Butte say 3,500 Chinese in Butte. I think when people err in those ways, they tend to err up. because we want our story to be special and to be just more important with the sheer numbers. I want to be conservative only if I can corroborate those numbers in a number of different sources. And what I'll say as a warning, when you're digging through newspaper accounts and you see a number of Chinese ascribed to a location, read the context, and if it's got an anti-Chinese flair to it, it's probably an exaggeration. Why would there be an exaggeration of Chinese numbers back in an 1873 newspaper account saying there's really this many Chinese here? Or an 1882 Chinese a newspaper account saying there's really this many Chinese? What do you think? Fear. And saber rattling, so to speak, about this Chinese threat, this, quote, yellow peril.
Taking our jobs.
Exactly. And so the exaggeration often is done out of an anti-Chinese sentiment, but some people in the present will look back and find a notation in a newspaper and say, oh, that must be true. Okay, you got to corroborate those numbers. And like I said, when I err, I tend to err low. I think I tend to err. I want to corroborate as high as I can, but I've got to have multiple data points. Okay. Now, this census for Bannack in 1870 doesn't give us much information. Kristen's great presentation had names and property values and things like that. This is the Bannack census in 1870. Some of you can maybe read that better than the Chinese I had on the previous screen. Quote, Chinaman, quote, Chinawoman, Chinaman, Chinawoman. Not much detail. We've got age, but their identities are obscured from us. Okay. Now, what I found interesting as I dug into this work at Brenna Maloney's request is Bannack was definitely gold mining, and Chinese did come to mine gold in the Big Sky State, the treasure state, right? But they weren't there in great numbers, and yet just further east, we have Virginia City at about around 300 Chinese, 279. We can assume that almost every counting is a bit of an undercount, right? Sometimes the Chinese were here under less than legal circumstances and might have tried to evade census enumerators and government officials. I think they all are likely some undercounting, but not to the tune of like it's really 405 in Missoula, things like that, right? But if you look over here, this is pretty contemporaneous. Gold discovered in Virginia City and Alder Gulch. Large Chinese communities. Where's Bannack on this map? It's right there with the question mark. Okay, so why, with gold discovered at roughly the same time period and Chinese involved in some way, shape, or form in gold mining, or at least supporting mining towns, why were there not more than these Chinese folks in Bannack at the same time as they obviously settled in these areas? And that's a question that I wanted to try and dig into. But also, how do you tell a story of absence? If they weren't there, how do we tell that story? That becomes difficult to try and tell in corroborated sources and things like that. So I know the cursive here is hard to read, so I put it into a graph here. This is the 1870 census for the Chinese in Bannack. I'm talking at you a lot. Turn and talk at your table. What do you find interesting about these 5 Chinese folks who are noted there? What's of note? Turn, make a friend, share your thoughts about what's interesting. All right. I heard they're very young. Okay. I heard they're mostly involved in washing. Okay. Some people might be thinking this Nancy, Chinese woman named Nancy, obviously not her name back from where she's from in China. She took on an English name possibly. This keeping house, should that be in quotation marks? Maybe indicating prostitution. Some people want to take that leap and say that the Chinese women who came to the American West were almost all working as prostitutes. Well, what I saw in the census is the census enumerator who did this study for Bannack. He noted a number of people keeping house, mostly white women, and it was pretty clear that they were married to the head of the household. And so to say that they were keeping house seemed to be what the census enumerator noted. So I don't think this is a euphemism. What do you note about gender, though? I was a math major for about a semester at Carroll College. What's the percentage of women? 40%, right? Is that right? 40%, right? That seems pretty high. Knowing what we know about gender, the gender ratio being way out of balance later on. Okay, by 1900 in Montana, there'll be 40 Chinese men for every one Chinese woman. So to have 2 Chinese women in Bannack seems of note. Well, this is 1870. This is before something called the Page Act in 1875 that specifically tried to bar Chinese women from gaining entry. And so there were more Chinese women at the earliest days of non-native settlement in Montana. So it's kind of interesting. Whether they're married, whether they're single, those things will be somewhat interesting. But how do we tell this story of absence? Well, if they were there, and in these small numbers, but in much larger numbers in Virginia City and Alder Gulch and stuff like that, maybe something happened. And something did happen. Why so few? The newspapers at the time say a fresh importation of, quote, Chinamen. About 300 arrived from Bannack City this morning, having been driven away from that camp by the miners. So there were 300 in Bannack at one point in time, or were there? A Bannack friend at our elbow suggests that the fellow who told that told a whopper. For truth, there's never been 50 Chinese men in Beaverhead County. And so again, that exaggeration, that threat, that yellow peril, the numbers being amplified. But something did happen so that they weren't there in great numbers, and they should have been in just the mining development of Montana at that time. So we see in 1870, there's something going on. Well, placer mining had played out in Bannack pretty quickly, and then you need lode mining, you need more investment. And so in April 1870, it says, on account of the exhausted state of the mines of Bannack, it has been contemplated by the various mining companies here to employ cheaper laborers this season. Hence, encouragement has been held out to Chinese to seek employment here, and consequently a few have already arrived, with reports that others were on their way to Bannack. That's April, and then it says, a company was raised for the purpose of driving the Chinese from this camp. And Chinese have deserted Bannack and gone to other parts. So it seemed like with the easy-to-find placer gold playing out and the lode mining and the mining owners saying we don't want to pay the rates of labor that we'd have to pay, we're going to try and employ cheaper workers. And oftentimes the Chinese were, there was a lot of rhetoric about them undercutting wages. Who's undercutting wages here? The owners. So why be mad at the Chinese? That's a little bit of an aside. But it seems like there was that threat, and if the Chinese were on their way to Bannack, there was a concerted effort to try and make sure they didn't reach it, didn't settle there, were not allowed to take root there, even though they had been in Virginia City, Alder Gulch, and places like that. So maybe this is what's going on, and this would have been in April before these accounts in May, right? So they had that opportunity, were probably pushed aside, and then simply deserted Bannack and had gone to other parts. The 1880 census is very complicated. Bannack's population had shrunk to the point that it wasn't a specific enumerated district named Bannack. It was more broad, Jefferson Gulch and things like that. So it's really hard to disaggregate the data from the 1880 census. But in 1900, we see this number of Chinese folks in Bannack. All right? Gender has changed. Age has changed. We begin to get names, and so maybe we can corroborate and find them in other documentation. So it's definitely more personal. We see their occupations still being pretty much laundry and then cooks. Okay. We see that they're married to whom? To whom? This was a commonality in the Chinese experience across the American West. Oftentimes you'll hear them referred to as bachelor societies. That really isn't true. In Montana, about 45% of the men are married, and yet there's very few Chinese women here. So who are they married to? Not non-Chinese folks. That was socially unacceptable and eventually legally impossible. They're married to women back home in southern China. Definitely. Okay. The cultural imperative to produce children was very important in Chinese culture and still is. Those children are going to then give offerings to the ancestors who've gone before in death. So it's very important to have children. And these men would have been under heavy pressure to have children. The letters that we had translated are constantly saying, send more money, come home and get married, send more money, come home and get married. And they would go home and get married, hopefully produce a child during their brief time home in China, and then come back to the West to send that life-saving money back. Okay, so they are definitely married, and married two people back in southern China. So we see a little bit of a blip, but this doesn't tell us much more information. I want to know what they left behind. If they were there in great numbers, they should leave some stuff behind. Well, they did, and here's a residence that might have served as that Chinese laundry in Bannack. This is a picture from about a month ago, just across the street from the beautiful church. And in archaeological digs and remediation work and fire suppression work and things like that, some things did start to surface, start to raise from Bannack's Chinese community. For instance, these Chinese coins. And if you're ever doing a Chinese archaeological dig, you'll likely find these Chinese coins. They're circular with a square in the middle. It's thought that there's two reasons for that. Ease of transportation, that you could string a piece of rawhide and stuff like that and carry a number of them. But also in a Chinese sense of the world, that heaven is round and the earth is square. So this is the earth encompassed by heaven. The inscriptions on these coins tell us they're from the 1700s. Okay, so pretty important find in Bannack's Chinese archaeological record. I don't think they were used for commerce. They tended to be used more for talismans, for good luck, for gaming pieces, things like that from the Chinese community in the North American West. We also see left behind various elements that came from China as well. A lot of pottery and ceramics are left behind. A lot of times when people want to talk about the Chinese in the West, they'll hear this phrase, double happiness. And that's a type of white pottery with blue, not engraving, but blue embedded into it. It's beautiful, and it has a double happiness sign on it. That tends to be a little bit earlier than the Chinese came to Montana. That'd be 1850s and 60s. We don't find much double happiness pottery in Montana. This is four-season flower pottery. You can see how small and delicate it is. This was likely either part of a rice bowl, a teacup, a serving plate, something like that, that absolutely would have been manufactured in southern China, made its way to Hong Kong, to San Francisco, to Corinne, Utah, up to Dillon, up to Virginia City, and over to Bannack. And so they did leave some of this stuff behind. That's more fine ware. What also shipped were pickled vegetables, flour, rice, soy sauce, vinegar, in what's called Chinese brown glazed stoneware. So if you're ever doing anything related to the Chinese, you should see this rougher pottery that's for transportation of those type of goods. And we see this surface in the Bannack example in these fragmentary pieces here. Sometimes you'll hear this type of pottery referred to as celadon. That's kind of a phrase that's a little bit out of fashion now. That's a French phrase. This now we call wintergreen ceramics. And these fine pieces emerged from Bannack's archaeological record as well, saying that there were Chinese people eating, drinking, living, dying here in Bannack. And so we see these are likely, again, lips to a teacup or a plate or a rice bowl. Very beautiful pieces here. Done. It's got a high iron content, and when glazed, that green comes out. Beautiful. We know where it was produced in China and used in Bannack is pretty exciting. And we see some of these not in such fragmentary pieces, but a little bit more intact. So we see possibly a rice bowl. On the bottom of that is what's called a reign mark, R-E-I-G-N, a reign mark. These marks would have been put on pieces of pottery that were approved, a kiln that is approved by the emperor. So the emperor is saying, yes, I give the blessing for this kiln to produce the finest of pottery. Whether that really was this kiln was, or whether it's kind of a knockoff that then they're going to mass produce this, we don't really know. This is a very stylized, old form of Chinese writing that's pretty much illegible, but it would have given an air of authority to this piece used in Bannack. Something that's a little bit more legible is a small piece here, probably a teacup, with this Chinese symbol. Oftentimes the kilns would put symbols like this that would have some auspicious meaning to them, some symbolic meaning to them. So this is the Chinese character for eye or vision. And so you get a sense that there's some symbolic and auspicious meanings to that piece as well. So some pieces that are more intact, pretty exciting to find. But I know you don't want to hear about tea and rice. You come to a Chinese presentation, you want to hear about opium. Opium, right? I know you, I know. So opium paraphernalia, is that what's left behind? Absolutely, Chinese folks used opium. Okay? A good comparison is how many Western European folks use alcohol. to relax, somewhat medicinally, a pain reliever. And yes, some people abuse alcohol, some people abused opium, certainly, certainly. Opium was legal to use in Montana. In 1881, there was a law that said you couldn't distribute it wholesale from businesses, but you could still import it and use it. It wasn't until about 1909 that it became illegal to import opium, so it's not quite as illicit as maybe we want it to be back in the past. But we have to be careful. Whenever we're dealing with the Chinese in Montana or the North American West, we can tend to exoticize, mysticize anything that comes out of the ground related to the Chinese. And so we tend to find strange things and say, ha, that's got to be opium. Like this little tiny bottle. And on Facebook, I saw somebody posting this, very cool. That's similar to extract of opium bottle that I have. Oh, it's probably a similar bottle to what you have, but extract of opium, not so much. These are medicinal bottles, tiny, tiny vials that would have had tinctures of Chinese traditional medicine from the home country. So they absolutely are medicinal and used by the Chinese, but they are not opium bottles. So oftentimes you'll hear that claim that the lid on this, the opening on this is tiny. And opium didn't ship as a liquid, it shipped as a paste. How are you going to cram the opium paste in and get it out of these little bottles? These do rise in Chinese sites, absolutely. They're tinctures from the home country, medicinal bottles. Because opium shipped in these, so-called, quote, opium tins. These would have carried about a ½ pound of opium in paste form. Okay, and these are all from Bannack, the archaeological dig done in Bannack. So these absolutely are, they're probably brass with tin covering, and they persist long after their initial use. So you do find them a lot because they'd be repurposed to use for different things. So these three great examples come from the digs in Bannack. So we do know that opium was being used definitely by Chinese and probably by non-Chinese folks as well. And then we see other things often attributed to opium. Anytime you see something that seems like a part of a pipe, some folks are going to call it opium pipe. Okay? So we see this angle here and this angle here, misattributed as opium pipe. These are from Chinese digs in Bannack. They probably did have Chinese users using these, but these are from tobacco pipes. Okay? Because opium is, not speaking from personal experience, it's ingested in a different way. Okay? These tobacco pipes, the tobacco would have been burned here and inhaled, cooling it along here, right? But it would have been burned and inhaled. And so this probably is a Chinese tobacco pipe. It's still Chinese, possibly a Chinese tobacco pipe. Still Chinese, but not ascribed to being opium. This is what an opium pipe looks like. And so you still have that long stem, but you've got this clay bowl here, because opium is not burned, it's vaporized and inhaled. If opium were burned, the effective compounds are negated. And so it needs to be heated, and vaporized in that bowl. And this is a fragment of an opium pipe from Bannack. And so you will find these, but they're clay and they're very fragile. And so even if there was a Chinese presence there, they may have deteriorated just due to wear over the years. But this, we can say with pretty good certainty, is a fragment of an opium bowl from Bannack. And that's a depiction from a newspaper account, not terribly respectful depiction, of a Chinese user lighting the opium to then be vaporized. Okay? So definitely evidence of opium usage. You just got to be careful with what you ascribe to what pieces. What we can tell from all of these pieces, from the four-season flower, from the wintergreen, from the Chinese brown glazed stoneware to the opium, is that the Chinese were deeply interconnected with transnational trade. These pieces that rise from that small community of maybe 5 or 7 or 9 Chinese folks in Bannack would have, again, like I said, come through this trans-Pacific, trans-global trade. And that's a pretty exciting thing. There wasn't a merchant shop in Bannack because there just wasn't a large enough Chinese community to sustain that. But there would have been one in Virginia City, one in Dillon with a Chinese population of about 90. And so they would have gone there to get these type of goods. Now, what else would have been very important to the Chinese in Bannack would be ministering to their spiritual needs. Did they keep their culture, their religions alive in such a often hostile environment and such a small community? Absolutely they did. But they were not a large enough community to have their own Chinese temple, This is the Chinese temple in Virginia City. I guarantee the Chinese from Bannack would have gone over to Virginia City during Lunar New Year, during important festivals, to have brotherhood, to have cultural connectivity, to express themselves religiously. Another way that they expressed themselves religiously was by doing things like this. Some of you have been with me throughout this week, know what this picture is of. What's it of? A burial, a funeral. So you see a funeral procession. This is actually from Missoula. White is the color of death for Chinese folks from this part of southern China. So you can see the mourners here, the body is here. This is up by Front Street. Cranky Sam's Brewery is right about in the same area here. They're taking the body from Missoula's Chinatown out to the base of Mount Jumbo, where the body was interred. Goods were burned, transforming them from utility in this life to utility in the next life. These are not Chinese folks, though. These are interested onlookers, and the body would have been buried here in the Rattlesnake neighborhood by Cherry Street, where there is currently a school and a neighborhood that has been built over this historic Chinese cemetery. But in terms of Chinese cemeteries, I do a lot of work across the state to try and find where Chinese were buried in the state. They lived here, absolutely. They died here. Some of them remain here. Some were sent back home to southern China, and we'll talk about that in a second. Whenever I'm looking for a Chinese cemetery, I go to the cemetery and I go to the edge. So this is Billings Mount View Cemetery. Very well manicured, nice. Here's all the Chinese graves. And there's about 20 headstones there in Billings. I'm going to propose a session next year for Billings. We're going to do a walking tour of this. Would you go on that? Good. Tell Christine we'll get that session approved, right? So on the edge there's headstones. This is Livingston's Mountain View Cemetery, well manicured, Chinese graves on the edge. This is Helena's Forest Vale Cemetery. We got Sanders, Hauser, Fergus, all the founding fathers of Montana, and the Chinese section is on the edge. Well, through leads provided by Mitzi Rosalon, by Brenna Maloney, by Susie Havener from Bannack, they said, Mark, we think we might have a connection to a Chinese cemetery in Bannack. And so they took some pictures. I came down, packed a lunch. It's quite a drive. Went down, and here's Bannack's old cemetery. And on the edge right here, we think we've identified a possible Chinese burial site in Bannack, even with that very tiny community. To try and show you what we found, on the ground there, on the surface scatter, we see Chinese brown glazed stoneware. Okay? And so when taking a body out to be buried, you'd want to feed the spirit. You want to burn certain things to be of utility in the next life. If you don't do these things, the spirit is going to wander as a hungry ghost. So you want to feed that spirit. You take rice, tea, baijiu, which is a hard Chinese liquor, and you'd leave those things out there. And they've been left for years and years and years. And only this last fall, about a year ago, we found these for the first time and think that it helps us pinpoint where the Chinese cemetery was. Here's four-season flower pottery. Here's wintergreen pottery out in that section of Bannack's, what I think we can ascribe is a Chinese section of the cemetery there. So there's future work to be done there, and that's an exciting new find. And the more we dig into this, the more layers there are to the Chinese story in Montana. But that story of absence, how do we tell that? How do we get past the anonymous, quote, Chinaman or anonymous China woman on the 1870 census? I've also found one record that might give us more information. This is from a book that's currently housed at the Newberry Library in Chicago. It's about 60 pages, all written by the same person's hand. It's got over 200 total entries. Many of them are global, of New South Wales, of British Columbia, of Honolulu, of New York City, of Los Angeles, but over 100 of them are places in Montana, written by a Chinese guy, and what we have is the place given in English and then Chinese characters. And I worked very hard to get this translated. To translate this into spoken Mandarin today is not going to get us any closer to it because there's no way these men spoke Mandarin. So what I did is I found a speaker of the dialect that the migrants who came to Montana would have spoken. That's a dialect called Taishanese or Toisanhua from the county that they're from. And when we translated these characters into Taishanese, it turns out these are sound-alikes for the place names in Montana. So for instance, on another page, there's Sun River, Montana. Well, it's not the Chinese character for sun and the Chinese character for river. It's how you would verbalize that to make a non-Chinese speaker understand the words you're saying. And so these characters, verbalized in Taishanese, say Isa Bannack. Isa Bannack. And so somebody made this book, this kind of correspondence back and forth, to be able to say, I need to get to East Bannack. Here's how I think I say it. I'm not sure what this book is. I'm not sure what kind of connections there were. I'm proposing that for Billings next year. So I've got some research to do. But we can tell a story of absence even when the people aren't there and they didn't leave much behind. But I think it takes creativity. As was mentioned, I'm working on the next book. It's going to be an illustrated, a graphic depiction of Montana's Chinese folks. So I'm working on it with my son, who's a sophomore in high school. That's Thomas. We did think it was very important to have a Chinese-American partner on this who is going to be depicting the Chinese in a graphic form. We wanted him to do it with cultural sensitivity and with the knowledge of the community. I'm a white guy from Great Falls, right? So we wanted a key partner like that. This partner is Rich Lee. We brought him up to Montana a couple of times, and he fell in love. He had no idea that there were Chinese people in Montana, right? He's from San Francisco's Chinatown. That's the center of his world. But we expanded his sphere of interest, and it turns out this is Square Butte near Great Falls, and Rich Lee loved a Montana artist. Anybody see a little homage to a Montana artist in this piece? Charlie Russell, okay? So Rich Lee loved that, and he's working hard to try and help us tell this story, the research we've done, and we're trying to tell this story in a creative way, grounded in the sources, hopefully to reach a new readership, maybe middle school, high school, undergrad type students. And so we say, laws. I was in Bannack when they hanged their sheriff. They call themselves vigilantes. Their justice comes at the end of a rope. We're trying to take my academic research, package it in a little different way to a different readership, infuse it with new research that I've done since the release of my first book, and try and tell these stories, give these people humanity, culture, resilience in an often hostile anti-Chinese context in Montana. I love what I do. I love to get to share it with interested folks. Love to hear your questions, your thoughts, your comments, how you can add to this story. Thank you very much.